Back, everybody, to another lecture here in History 1301, and today the topic that we will be covering is that of the sectional crisis that emerges immediately after the end of the Mexican-American War, to where we'll see Americans will become divided more than ever before over the issue of whether or not slavery should be expanded over into those territories. Now, just to kind of set the scene a little bit, just to recount what we've seen last time in a lecture, at the conclusion of the Mexican-American War through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States essentially doubled in size. It gained access and control over all the territories out in the American Southwest, places like California, New Mexico, Utah, and so on and so forth. However, while Americans will initially be united at the fact that they've achieved their goal of manifest destiny of creating a continental empire made of liberty, a major question emerges almost immediately after the end of hostilities with the Mexican-American War. What is to become of those territories? Will those territories enter the Union as free states eventually, or will they enter as slave states? And it'll be that very issue of whether or not slavery should be accepted out in the Western territories that will come to rip apart the nation in the years to come. Now, before we start approaching the various events that occurred during the course of the period just before the Civil War, I think it's important for us to talk about one important term that I'm going to mention periodically throughout this lecture that's going to come to dominate Americans' thoughts during the 1850s. Now, immediately after the Mexican-American War, with this major issue beginning to emerge, one Lewis Cass of Michigan, who would ultimately be the Democratic nominee for the president in 1848, he's going to propose his solution to how the Union could resolve this potential crisis. And he would present this idea known as popular sovereignty, which will come to dominate the American political landscape for the next decade or so. And through popular sovereignty, he states that where the federal government had long had the authority to determine whether or not a state would be free or slave, out in the territories they should practice this idea of popular sovereignty. Bring democracy to the people. Let them decide in their territories if they would enter the Union as a free or a slave state. Now, this form of democracy, just like Jacksonian democracy, has major limitations because not everybody can vote, but nonetheless, this was his solution. And immediately, the Democrats aren't going to accept this because many Southern Democrats believe that this would ultimately lead to the stoppage of slavery's expansion. But in time, this idea would be adopted, and we'll talk about it a little bit later on. But anyways, almost immediately after the Mexican-American War, people are going to be at each other's throats over this very issue. And it mainly emerges by 1849 as we see one of those territories out in the West, that of California, look to enter the Union as a free state. Now, beginning in 1848 and really boiling over into 1849, California is going to undergo a gold rush. Now, the California gold rush will see hundreds of thousands of individuals, both Americans as well as immigrants from Asia as well as Europe, arrive within California. But what's significant about the California gold rush within this string of events is quickly California reaches the necessary population to apply as a state in the Union. And it became clear that California wanted to enter the Union as a free state. And even President Zachary Taylor at the time, who had recently won an election after the Mexican-American War, he would press Congress to accept California as a free state so that way they wouldn't get into this issue of whether or not slavery should extend to that territory. However, Southerners, especially Southern fire-eating politicians, individuals like John C. Calhoun, who did not want to give in on this topic, would be staunch in their opposition to California's statehood. And at the end of 1849, as California was trying to enter the Union as a free state, Southern politicians would look to block its entrance into the Union. And Congress would enter a deadlock, and it looks like perhaps in the winter of 1849 and as we emerge into 1850, that this great crisis that was emerging over California could spill over into civil war. There were brawls that were being fought on the floors of Congress, and it was virtually chaos throughout much of the Western territories. When New Mexico, the following year, made it clear that they might enter the Union as a free state, the Texas governor at the time will send out Texas militia to New Mexico to stop this process. And it demonstrates that in 1850, it looks like America was on the verge of civil war. However, just like before, during the nullification crisis and the crisis surrounding Missouri, the Civil War will be delayed because America would reach a great compromise on what has become known as the Compromise of 1850. Now, as America was ripping itself apart, once again, all eyes are going to be set on the great compromiser himself, the most well-known politician in this period of American history, that of Henry Clay, to hopefully come out and in one last grand epic, establish one more compromise to hopefully save the Union and resolve this issue over whether or not slavery should expand in the territories once and for all. And Henry Clay, he no longer was a young politician that we had met back during the War of 1812, but now he was a man of 72 years old, or 72 years of age. And this would prove to be his last great epic, as he would be dead 2 years after he establishes this compromise. But nonetheless, he would begin to draft what would become known as his omnibus bill, to where he would offer several resolutions to try to compromise with both northern abolitionists as well as southern slaveholding politicians, to hopefully resolve the crisis over California. As a part of this compromise, he wanted California to enter the Union as a free state, but Southerners had to get major concessions. We'll see that he would agree to allow a more strict Fugitive Slave Act to go into effect. We'll also see in the case of Texas, as my light decides to go out, sorry about that, folks. But anyways, in the case of Texas, he would also try to convince some of the slave owners there that if they gave up their claims to New Mexico, he would pay off all their debts. On top of that, there would be several other clauses that he would try to convince both sides to agree to. And all of these efforts at compromise were good, but the problem at first was that they were all in one bill. And if you were, it didn't matter if you were an abolitionist, if you were a slaveholding Southerner, or somebody in between, if you disagreed with one of the clauses in that overall bill, you would strike it down. And it's no surprise that by the summer of 1850, after a grand debate had ensued, that the bill would be struck down, because simply there was no support for all of these clauses. And by the summer of 1850, it looks like the compromise was dead in the water. Even the president at the time, Zachary Taylor, didn't approve of it. However, on July 4th, 1850, fate would be in the hands of establishing a compromise. We'll see that President Taylor would die 4 days after he suffered sunstroke on July 4th. And then following that, Millard Fillmore, who was his vice president, who was a friend of compromise, would work behind the scenes once he's taken over as president to get Clay's compromise pushed forth. However, there was a still issue, how to get all these politicians to agree to this one bill. And this is where one Stephen Douglas would step in and actually take up the shoes of Henry Clay to establish this compromise. And he will argue that rather than having one bill, let's make 5 separate. Because if you disagreed with one of the bill, you simply would strike it down, but it would gain support from the other side of the aisle. And unlike the omnibus bill, you wouldn't have unanimous condemnation against the one singular bill. And his plan ultimately worked out by breaking it up into 5 separate bills, one by one. By September of 1850, a compromise had been established. California entered the Union as a free state, and it looks like that issue of slavery would never appear again. And even Henry Clay, dying 2 years later after establishing this compromise, believed he had saved the Union. However, rather than saving the Union, the Compromise of 1850 merely delayed the Civil War 10 years, because that issue of whether or not slavery should expand out in the territories is going to disappear. Now, the biggest controversy that will come out of the Compromise of 1850 is going to be that of the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, the Fugitive Slave Act, one of those acts that was passed as a part of those 5 separate bills that Douglas had proposed, it called on Northerners, regardless of their situation, that if they came into contact with a fugitive slave, a runaway slave, they were required by federal law to return them to their masters in the South. And it also granted Southern slave owners a lot of power when dealing with runaway slaves. If they wanted to, they could go simply into the North, capture any person of color, and bring them before a judge to where it would be redeemed as their property. Now, why is that significant? Because with the Fugitive Slave Act, there wasn't a clear definition of what a fugitive slave was. Merely any African American in the North, regardless if they had been born into bondage, regardless if they were a runaway, even if they were somebody who had been free their whole lives, under this act, theoretically, they could be thrown back into the institution of slavery. And so no surprise that this act would be heavily condemned by Northerners, and eventually, because of that act, it would lead to the publication of one of the best-selling books of the 19th century, that of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which should heavily condemn the Fugitive Slave Act, and it would actually galvanize a lot of Northern support for ending the institution of slavery and ensuring that that issue of slavery would remain in the minds of Northerners. However, it won't have a significant impact on politics quite yet, and we'll see for the time being, even though there was outrage over this Fugitive Slave Act and there was protests being conducted against it throughout the North, we'll see for the time being a sectional crisis begins to calm down. However, that question of whether or not slavery should expand in the territories will pop up once again, this time over the construction of a transcontinental railway. Now, during the election of 1852, there was a new president, a man by the name of Franklin Pierce. But anyways, when he takes over office, his first year in office, the grand question within his administration is how to construct a transcontinental railway. Where should it be built? And just like every issue at this time, it would be divided along sectional lines. Now, the reason that the Pierce administration wants to construct a transcontinental railway is because it can benefit commerce and connect the nation coast to coast, connect this grand empire of liberty, if you will. But as mentioned before, it will be divided on sectional lines on where to build that railway. Northern politicians like Stephen Douglas are going to argue that it should be built out of Chicago, going all the way to Sacramento through a northerly route, which would benefit the northern economy. Meanwhile, the current Secretary of War under the Pierce administration, that of Jefferson Davis, would argue that the railroads should go through the south, through the newly acquired lands from Mexico. However, in the end, it would be Douglas who would prevail in getting the argument, at least for the time being, for the transcontinental railway to be built through the north. And how he's going to accomplish this is through what's known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, the origins of the Kansas-Nebraska Act are based within this attempt to build the first transcontinental railway. Now, in order for Douglas to win his argument and have the first transcontinental railway built through the north, built through his hometown of Chicago, he needed to make sure that the territories out of that old Louisiana Purchase that were west of Iowa were formed and organized, so that way construction could be laid. And so in order to organize these territories, he presents what's known as the Kansas-Nebraska Bill, which will become highly controversial. Now, through the Kansas-Nebraska Bill, what it essentially calls for is it states that the territories of the old Louisiana Purchase would be organized for the building and construction of this railway. However, initially it was supposed to be one territory, but in order for Douglas, a Democrat, to gain, or I should say a Northern Democrat, in order for him to gain Southern support for this bill, he had to give some concessions over to the Southerners. He would agree that he would divide up the territory into at least 2 territories, and some Southerners would even call for 4 territories to be made out of this. But also on top of this, he would use the idea of popular sovereignty to organize those territories. The people living out in Kansas and Nebraska, they should be given the right to determine whether or not they would accept or reject slavery. And that's why Southerners wanted 2, 3, or even 4 territories made out of it, because it would mean more slave states or more potential slave states that would enter the Union, maintain that balance of power within the Senate, and ensure that slavery would continue to expand and thrive. However, the very controversial thing about the Kansas-Nebraska Act is both of those territories were north of that 3630 line that had been established by the Missouri Compromise. Now, why is that significant? Well, it's because, if we remember, everything north of that 3630 line was closed off to slavery. And if this bill were to be accepted, it would completely reject the Missouri Compromise and allow slavery to expand northward. And, narrowly, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, or the Kansas-Nebraska Bill, will pass, be signed into law by President Franklin Pierce, and effectively would begin to organize the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, allowing those 2 territories to accept slavery even though they were north of that 3630 line. This is where it gets controversial, because in the ensuing months, especially in Kansas, which was seen as up for grabs, both pro-slavery advocates as well as abolitionists and free soilers are going to flock to the region to impact upcoming elections to ensure that Kansas enters the Union as on their respective side. Meanwhile, just to kind of talk about Nebraska, it was assumed from the beginning that it would be a free state. But anyways, nonetheless, tens of thousands of people will begin to flock to Kansas and violence will ensue. And we'll talk about the episode of Bleeding Kansas here in a minute. But anyways, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is also going to be pivotal because it's going to lead to a fundamental shift in American politics. Most notably is because we'll see that the old Whig Party that had been founded by Henry Clay after his death could no longer be held together. Southern Whigs had allied themselves with Southern Democrats, and Northern Whigs, disgusted by the recent Kansas-Nebraska Act and that it was allowing the expansion of slavery, went off and formed their own organization. And this new organization would become known as the modern-day Republican Party. Now, the Republican Party, when it was initially founded, it was founded as basically an anti-slavery party. And its official platform would stem off of the issue of stopping slavery's expansion out into the West. And it would become a very formidable force, even within its first decade of existence, and it would fill that gap left by the destruction of the Whig Party in 1854. And quickly we'll see abolitionists, free soilers who supported stopping the expansion of slavery out in the West would flock to this political party. And by the end of the decade, they would come to dominate the political landscape. However, as they began to form their political party, we'll see out in Kansas, as a result of this act, a mini civil war would break out in an episode known as Bleeding Kansas. Now, the worst fear of many of these new Republicans who had joined this new party was that out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it would bring about violence, and this is exactly what will occur. As I had mentioned a moment ago, since Kansas was up for grabs and it didn't clearly define it within Kansas's territorial laws who was considered a resident, we'll see pro-slavery advocates, free soilers, and abolitionists would flock to the state to ensure that in the upcoming elections, Kansas would become either a free or a slave territory. And what followed was a scene of violence. The first elections would be held in early 1855. However, Missourians from across the border of Kansas would take up arms and march into the state, impacting the upcoming elections, intimidating voters from voting a free government to be elected into office, and promoting slavery interest. And it's no surprise that that election would be a complete fraud. And afterwards, these Missourians would take up arms again, and quickly what will happen with the show of violence, and since the fact we'll also see that free soilers were not willing to step down either, is a violent episode that would characterize guerrilla war, atrocities, and see hundreds of people's homes burned, millions of dollars of property damage, and likewise 57 individuals killed over the course of the next 4 years as warfare grips Kansas. And it essentially was a mini civil war within itself. In 1856, we'll see that the free soil capital at Lawrence would be sacked by pro-slavery forces. And just days after that, we'll see that one John Brown, a staunch abolitionist from Massachusetts, would come into the state with some of his sons, rip out in the middle of the night 5 pro-slavery advocates, and hack them to death with swords. And this was a violence that was quickly enswirling all over Kansas that would carry on over the course of the next 4 years. And that violence would not just be limited to the borders of Kansas. It will actually boil over onto the floors of Congress. In a fiery, impassioned anti-slavery speech, one Charles Sumner, a senator from Massachusetts, would condemn those who had written the Kansas-Nebraska Act as well as supported it. However, after delivering this speech, he had delivered much of his wrath towards one Andrew Pickens, a senator from South Carolina. However, Pickens, he wasn't present at this speech, but his cousin, Preston Brooks, was. And after hearing these personal attacks made towards his cousin, Preston Brooks took it upon himself to confront Sumner and personally cane him near to death on the floors of Congress. And it demonstrated in 1856 that the nation was beginning to unravel. Northerners would support Charles Sumner, Southerners would support Preston Brooks, seeing him as a great hero for their cause. And it couldn't even get worse, you couldn't think that it could possibly get worse in the year 1856. Because that same year, we're going to see a presidential election. And America in this election was going to select whether or not they would delay the Civil War and allow the expansion of slavery, or if they would have the Civil War in 1856. But they would eventually vote to delay it. And one James Buchanan would take over the White House. However, he won't be able to solve the nation's woes as they continue to spiral out of control. Most notably because within the early days of his administration, he would argue where the legislative and executive branches had failed to address this question and answer it once and for all, he'd state that the judiciary branch was about to deliver a decision in just 2 days' time that would solve this issue once and forever. And 2 days later, on March 6th, the case he was referring to is known as the Dred Scott case. Now, the Dred Scott case concerns one formerly enslaved person by the name of Dred Scott, who during almost the entirety of the decades of the 1830s had lived on northern soil as an enslaved person under his master John Emerson. However, when he returned back to bondage in St. Louis and after his master Emerson had died, he would protest for his freedom. However, at virtually every court below the U.S. Supreme Court, he had been denied his freedom. And eventually he would take his case before the U.S. Supreme Court and state that since he was on free soil, that ultimately he should be granted his freedom. However, in an infamous decision, we'll see that Roger Brooke-Taney, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, would state that Dred Scott, since he was considered a slave and thus considered property, he was not even a human being. He was no different in Taney's eyes from a piece of furniture or from an inanimate object. And because of this, he could not be classified as a citizen and could not bring his case before the U.S. Supreme Court. And on top of that, Taney would go further, trying to address that issue that Scott had brought up of free territory north of the 3630 line. And here Taney would state and overturn and repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820, that 3630 line, declaring that it was unconstitutional, and this is only the second time in American history that an act passed by Congress had been deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And this was what Buchanan believed would ultimately be the case that would decide the fate of the Union, decide ultimately this issue, and Americans could move on from the sectional differences. But this is only going to heighten tensions and make things worse. Meanwhile, Buchanan's also going to do something else that's going to make the situation much worse and continue to rip apart the nation. In the episode of Bleeding Kansas, when he enters office, he wants to see Kansas enter the Union as a state, regardless if it was a free or a slave state, as soon as possible. And with this, he's going to support in 1857 a very controversial constitution that had been pushed through Kansas. Now, once again, in 1857, the territory of Kansas would once again try to hold elections. However, they too would be rigged and heavily impacted to where a pro-slavery legislature was elected. However, when ballots were recounted, it was a pro-free soil legislature that had been elected that opposed slavery. But nonetheless, the pro-slavery faction, even in the light of this, by October of 1857, they would send off a constitution they had drafted that would allow slavery to exist in Kansas and it to enter the Union as a slave state. And on top of that, what's become known as the Lecompton Constitution, if adopted, it could not be amended for 7 years. And Buchanan, regardless of despite the fact that none of the people of Kansas really agreed with this constitution, he calls on Congress to adopt it, to get Kansas in the Union as soon as possible. It would be a very heated debate in Congress over this very issue. However, nonetheless, the Lecompton Constitution would be accepted by a sectional vote. Southerners would support it, Northerners would oppose it. However, for reasons unknown, Buchanan would veto this. And before any further debates could be made on the Lecompton Constitution, Congress is going to call on the people of Kansas to practice popular sovereignty, let them vote, and decide whether or not they would adopt or reject this Constitution. And to no surprise, in elections that were held at the end of 1857 and early 1858, overwhelmingly, by almost 10-1, and in the second case by 11-1, the people of Kansas are going to reject this Constitution. It would be voted upon twice, and both times it would be rejected. Now, we're not going to talk more about Kansas, but the fighting will begin to die out somewhat after this. And Kansas, by 1859, will enter the Union as a free state. But still, the nation, even with this issue ongoing, was beginning to split apart even further. And in 1858, that would prove to be a very detrimental year for the Union, especially for the Democratic Party that was beginning to fall apart. Northern Democrats were being accused of being traitors, most notably Stephen Douglas, who had supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act, condemned the Lecompton Constitution of the Buchanan administration. And he was hopeful that in the upcoming election, or the upcoming presidential election in just 2 years' time, to be on the ballot and hopefully save the Union and save his Democratic Party in the process. However, in order for him to eventually be on the ballot in 1860, it's probably important that he wins re-election in 1858 to his senatorial seat. And he would be faced with very staunch opposition from one prairie lawyer by the name of Abraham Lincoln. What will ensue will become known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. In the upcoming debates, what the main issue would be at hand would be whether or not the state of Illinois would accept or reject the recent Kansas-Nebraska Act and show their displeasure with it. And the Republican Party was beginning to gain significant momentum out in Illinois, and they perhaps might be able to take control of that state legislature and impact state politics there. Now, in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the main issue that will be argued between both Lincoln as well as Douglas will be the issue of slavery and its expansion into the West. Lincoln, no abolitionist, I might add, would heavily condemn the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the expansion of slavery out into the West, and state that it was a great folly. However, I do want to mention with Lincoln, as he was beginning to condemn slavery's expansion, he was not an abolitionist. He did not support even the equality of African Americans, but his ideology would drastically change in due time. Douglas, in the debates, would support the Kansas-Nebraska Act and support that idea of popular sovereignty, stating that the reason he supported it was because he believed in the long run, by practicing popular sovereignty, it would limit the expansion of slavery. And then ultimately, slavery would slowly die out. And they would have two different approaches to their campaigns, which you can read upon. But nonetheless, in the end, after these debates take place, Douglas would retain his senatorial seat. But this really set up the matchup for 1860. Because these debates were viewed nationwide, and Lincoln now became basically a household name within the Republican Party and ensured that his rising stardom would lead him to the Republican nomination. But in the meantime, while Douglas may have won his office back in 1858, many Democrats had lost theirs. The Republican Party had gained majorities within the House of Representatives and were closing in on majorities within the Senate. In the meantime, there were further states that were added to the Union. However, the states of Minnesota as well as Oregon would enter the Union as free states, not as slave, and increasingly Southerners were becoming the minority within Congress. And as we get to 1858 and 1859, Americans more than ever were at each other's throats. And in order for a civil war to spark, in order to break that divide once and for all, you really needed one singular event that would make Southerners so suspicious of Northerners that they would never think about compromising with them. And that one singular event would be that of John Brown's raid. Now, John Brown's raid, really John Brown, we had talked about him just very briefly. He had played a role within the Bleeding Kansas episode. However, by 1857, he had basically disappeared from the national limelight. But he would reemerge because he believed he had been ordained by God to lead a grand slave uprising throughout the South, to where he would arm the enslaved populations of Maryland and Virginia and begin to march south all the way throughout the Deep South. Now, he would call in 1858 and 1859 on leading abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, Charles Sumner, as well as Frederick Douglass to provide funds, as well as perhaps even accompany him on his march down south on this grand crusade. However, each one of them, while they may have thrown a few dollars Brown's way, they ultimately wouldn't join him on his venture, viewing him as a fanatic, as basically insane for trying to promote such a raid. But nonetheless, by October of 1859, Brown had his pieces in place. He was eyeing Harper's Ferry, which was on the border between Maryland and Virginia. The reason he targeted that particular town was because of its arsenal, that housed tens of thousands of muskets as well as rifles that he could use to arm the local enslaved population. And as he arrives outside of Harper's Ferry on the night of October 16, 1859, he had sent out word throughout the countryside of Maryland and Virginia for the slaves to be ready to be armed. And with it, that very night, he would begin his grand crusade. However, even though he captures the arsenal, even though he captures prominent members of Harper's Ferry society, it did not have the intended effect he was hoping for. The enslaved population of the countryside would not come to his aid, and quickly he would be surrounded. And eventually a federal force of U.S. Marines under the command of one Robert E. Lee would surround Brown's forces within the engine house, and by October 18th attack it, capturing Brown, killing a few others, and capturing several others. And Brown, trying to incite a slave revolt, being captured in Southern Territory and being brought before a Virginia state court, would be condemned to death. However, he would accept his death in a calm fashion. And on December 2nd, 1859, he would be sent to the gallows. And his execution would go off almost seamlessly, even though there were fears that there would ultimately be an abolitionist conspiracy. But this single event, as we get into the year 1860, it divides Americans like never before. Initially, most Northerners are going to view John Brown as a fanatic and wouldn't have supported him, but in the coming year, some Americans will begin to express sympathy towards Brown. Meanwhile, Southerners, after John Brown's raid, they were so suspicious of Northerners. It didn't matter if they were a member of the Republican Party, the Democratic Party. As long as you were living in the North, they were under the impression that they were out to end their institution of slavery, and perhaps, as John Brown had done, incite a slave uprising. As we enter that year, 1860, it was crucial because it was a presidential election year. If Southerners didn't get their way, this could spell disaster and ultimately secession and disunion. That's exactly what will occur, and we'll go into more depth when we talk about it within our next lecture video. But anyways, we'll go ahead and we'll end on that note. But before we go ahead and end lecture, just like always, just as a reminder, make sure you go out, complete all outstanding assignments. Make sure that you read the corresponding chapter in the textbook with this topic, and then also make sure that you read all outstanding readings. But otherwise, in the meantime, everybody go out, be safe, and I'll see you all next time.